Hello, everyone. Dr. Nicole LaPera, the holistic psychologist here. So today I have someone really awesome that I've been following for a very long time, Katie Crosby. She is a pediatric occupational therapist those of you out there listening might be wondering why the heck I'm talking to a pediatric occupational therapist, but she's actually quite an expert and specializes in relationships, emotional regulation, and is really amazing, does a lot of great work. Her handle, and I'm going to be posting this all in the notes because I've already suggested many of you have contacted me about all things parenting advice, sending them her way. Thriving Littles on Instagram, YouTube, and I think you have a podcast as well is amazing, such a resource, quite honestly, invaluable in terms of all things conscious parenting. So today we're going to have a great conversation, talk a little bit about our little ones and emotionally regulating ourselves, helping them to emotionally regulate themselves. Incredibly important skills and tools. And those of you who listen to me always hear me talking about emotional resilience, and this is the how-to. So welcome, Katie, and I thank you so much for having a chat with me today.
Nicole, thank you so much for having me. I think there's so many parallels between the work that you do, and that's really the foundation. It's starting with us. So I'm so excited to talk about in the moment ideas and all the foundation that we can set for them through the way that we interact in our day-to-day lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I so agree. And anytime people ask me about parenting advice, that is always my number one suggestion is modeling and really making sure that as we're healing as the humans that we are, and as we are teaching and reparenting and kind of being very conscious and aware of our emotions and developing the tools, which quite honestly, a lot of us as parents did not get in our own childhood. That's always my number one advice is to parents, is to, engage in your own self-healing process, and that will 100% go a long way in helping your little ones. But I'm having you on because you are you're always talking about the practical, the daily, the how-to. And I think that this is really going to be helpful for a lot of listeners out there, because I know that we do want to talk a little bit more. Okay, well, that's all great. That's fine and great. But what do you mean? What do we mean in these moments? How can I show up, as the conscious parent who's maybe navigating my own emotional experience in a given moment, or my little ones, and or both. And sometimes that happens, and we have a lot of big emotions that I know that are part of the parenting experience. So you're very much about the practical application. I'm really excited to hear some of the tips. So kind of heading in, talk to me a little bit about what you mean when you say conscious parenting, and what maybe a general, kind of what is your idea about the role that a parent plays in terms of our little ones and their emotions?
Yeah. So first disclaimer, I'm not a parent. So my experience and my work with kids is really based on mileage, which with lots of kids with different sensitivities or vulnerabilities, especially, that really, really need this attuned support from us in order to develop their own self-regulation. And when I think about conscious parenting, I think about it's all about observing and being aware in the moment with kids and with ourselves. And I think Dan Siegel has a great book, Mindsight, and there's so many tools that you have out there for just the awareness that comes from being conscious in the moment. And for kids, it's helping them to develop that consciousness capacity, which we also know is self-regulation. So when I think about regulation, to take a step back, I would say it is the ability to take in information from the environment or others, and then monitor or modify our interaction or our response in the moment. So thinking about this process as a developmental process, it really sets the stage for kids learning and interaction with the world. And regulation is the basis of everything. So when I think about consciousness and regulation, how those things fit together, I think if you don't have a child that's regulated or an adult that's regulated, and it fluctuates all throughout the day and moment to moment, we're always shifting up and down throughout the day. But if we don't have this baseline idea of what we need in the moment to be calm and organized and available, then we tend to miss a lot and stay in our heads in this, it's almost like the narrative that we use as adults. It's like this ongoing narrative self that we have. If kids are not able to regulate, then they're acting on impulses, they're reactive, they're showing behaviors that, society views as negative and we don't want, essentially, or they're really getting in the way of interacting in the world in a way that feels fulfilling for them. So the big, broad answer of what I think is conscious parenting and emotional regulation.
Absolutely. I actually love that answer. And it touches a lot of the concepts that I'm always talking about. And I love what you said there. There was a gem in the middle. I mean, there was many of them, but when I heard, because I get a question a lot, acknowledging, right, that life is a roller coaster. So there can be things that happen, put it this way, in a given day that we feel about.
Yeah.
I really simplify. We feel high, we feel good, we
Right.
feel positive, and then we feel low. We feel some version of not good and not positive, right?
Mm-hmm.
Negative, if you will. And that's life. And I love that you pointed out that that is true, because a lot of the life that we're reacting to is, I will always talk to my clients about the range that exists that is not within our control. And I always share the brutal truth, I think for many of us, that a lot more falls outside that line of our control than we, I think, are comfortable with acknowledging. Meaning life happens. And to speak to your point, we could have different emotions and they could feel very much up and down. But what is important is finding that baseline of stability. That's not to say, because when I referenced earlier, I get a lot of questions. Some people will say to me, because I'm always talking about being an observer, and usually you'll hear me say words like being a neutral observer, just seeing the world, right, as objectively as possible for how it is. So in response to that, I get questions like, well, am I not going to have feelings then about the world? How will I know if someone's taking advantage of me to put, a boundary up? Does this mean that I'm just a passive recipient to all that which is? And so I love the way you even explained that in your definition, because no, that is not the byproduct of having that stable base that you most beautifully described having. Mm-hmm. It's just that we get, in the way my language or I language it is, I get choice in how I respond. The world's still happening. I can still feel about it. Yeah. Furthermore, I can make a choice if someone has crossed a limit of mine, or if something does not feel good and I need to use that to guide a future choice. But I get choice, and to use even language used, not to have that reactive existence of now I'm riding the emotional roller coaster that is the world outside of us.
That is such a good point. I think I hear the same thing with parents and kids, because emotional regulation isn't just being this like non-emotional being that's constantly regulated, and it's all about accepting all the emotions as they come and feeling it as and acknowledging it as energy that needs to come up and be felt in some way and experienced and then metabolized in some way. So yes, if we are constantly telling kids, and there's so many different styles out there, there's no right or wrong, but as an OT, I'm thinking about what is the most effective or helpful way to help child develop self-regulation. So the way that I look at parenting strategies or techniques is all about, how do we get this energy out of the body in an adaptive way versus shutting it down or internalizing it and pretending it isn't there, or telling a child not to get angry or not to get upset or don't cry or stop doing that. And there's so many tapes that we all heard as kids that show up when our child especially is crying or is hitting, because we have those biological triggers that were never really metabolized. So it's like our inner child, as in your language, is still, figuring out how to metabolize that emotion and feel the sensation and make sense of it. So it's really a cool opportunity. And I think there's this whole wave of everybody interested in this, and the research lately is really on par with, how do we help kids to understand and make meaning of their individual signals and cues of their body and their mind and their emotions in a way that it's communicating, and we can see it as either communication or healing that needs to come out in some way. So I think the first step that I talk to parents about is, I guess, the zero step. So the base is always understanding those in ourselves and recognizing in the moment. And then the next step is to really be an expert on each individual child. So there's so much information out there about ways to parent and ways to be with kids. But I think as an OT, what it really comes down to is looking at that individual child, because it looks so different and emotions are indefinable for to put a blanket statement on, because they're so individual in the way that we experience and the way that we feel them. And that each nervous system is as unique as a fingerprint. So we really need to be the ones that are investigating and exploring and being a detective, if you will, about each child, so we can make sense of what they're doing in the moment, or what their actions or behaviors are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love, I always, since I started to read your work, Katie, you talking and acknowledging the reality that similarly to the way I define emotions as energy. And I also think being so kind of aware as you are of the effect on our nervous system has always been, I've always found that so important as part of doing this work. And quite honestly, overlooked, if this isn't being talked about in terms of that, because the effect that our emotions have on our nervous system and the dysregulation of that nervous system, and the difficulty in self-soothing or in teaching the children to soothe themselves when we're in that dysregulated emotional or nervous system state, we could spin ourselves crazy, because without addressing that, I think, core dysregulation, we are doing ourselves, we are setting ourselves up not to be successful. And I also love how you're talking to two conversations here, right? One of which is the parent, again, acknowledging that some of the times in those moments with even our children, we are functioning from that inner child wound. So meaning we are not from the conscious adult state who is making or has available to us the choices quite often. Similarly to the way I talk in terms of partners and when we're with our partners, right? When we're both in a reactive state, that applies to children as well. So I love that you're highlighting, hey, parents out there, like, know that in some moments you too are possibly entered into a dysregulated, more childlike state in your own psyche, if you will, that similar is your child is in those moments. And I think that's part of the reality. But I love what you're saying in terms of the second step is knowing the individuality of your children. So can you give some, I guess, kind of practical, like how can we start to do that? How do we know if our child is having a feeling? Obviously, if we're out of our own inner child mode and we're showing up as the conscious adult, how can we begin to understand what is happening for, especially our little guys when they're pretty little and they maybe don't have the language to tell us?
Yeah. So there's a lot of different ways that this dysregulation can present. And I think you bring up a good point, because it's always these times of heightened stress when the behaviors that we don't want, if you will, are coming out for both of us or all of us. So when I'm looking at little kids, early childhood, and this can go all through the lifespan, because again, if we don't learn to regulate on our own in adaptive ways, it shows up all throughout life. So ways that little kids may communicate that they're having a hard time or they need us to guide them may be kind of action urges or behaviors that show up based on these emotions. So things like hitting or biting or kicking or not wanting to play with other kids. So not wanting to move in and experience joy with other people or other individuals, or kind of be more passive in the environment. So maybe they're in a room with toys and they're not sure where to start, or they're feeling unsure about exploring. That's a big sign of something going on and some dysregulation there. One that I see all the time is silliness. So, it's time to leave the clinic and the parent is stressed, ready to get somewhere. Everybody needs to get out the door. And this is in the morning too. I think you're ready to get out the door. There's a lot of things. Mornings can be big times for, boom, 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 ABC. Let's do this. Let's get on with the day. And then suddenly the child's running around silly, laughing or giggling, and nothing's really funny. So it's like there's not a match in the emotion that's being shown and what the situation is. So that's a big sign of dysregulation anytime we see that mismatch in, okay, here's what's happening right now and here's what the child's doing. So that's indicating to me that they may be having trouble identifying their emotion and showing us what they want or what they need in a way that makes sense to us. Other ways that dysregulation may show up, maybe things like them saying hurtful things to parents. So some kids may say things like, I hate you. I never want to be with you, or things that they, of course, probably don't mean, but in the moment they're using whatever tools they have available to communicate that they really don't feel good in the moment and they're needing our help in some way. So there's a lot of ways that we can look at the dysregulation, how it presents, and then questioning, how do we not assign meaning to those behaviors in the moment? Because we give it a meaning like, oh, they hate me. I'm a terrible parent. They don't love me. Oh no. And then our shame or our guilt is triggered. But what it really means is that the child's having a hard time and they're communicating that to us. And it's an opportunity to help and shape this into something that can be more adaptive. So in the beginning, when they're learning the emotional release, it comes out first as physical, embodied experience. So if they're angry, they hit. So it's more impulsive, it's more reactive. And it's this stage of development that is creating that. So until they get more nuanced and have more opportunities co-regulating, we say, or calming and organizing with a trusted adult, then these behaviors will show up because it's really developmentally age appropriate at the time.
Yeah.
So
I think that's incredible. And I'm so happy you shared those particular examples as well, because I think that they might kind of really trigger a lot of people and parents out there thinking, because again, from my perspective, another messaging that can become problematic. One, obviously, is personalization, right? So as parent, I see my child and I own that means something about me as parent. They hate me. They don't want to listen to me. It's about me. Another, I think, narrative that is equally as problematic that I then end up working with the adult who has internalized this narrative around has been when then the parent, unknowingly, obviously, of course, says something along the lines of, it means something about the child. So in terms of being uncooperative, or why can't you help mom? You're not helping mom get out the door. So now, again, inadvertently, out might slip some narrative that's obviously negative, again, to really simplify, that the child is bad, or that this is something about the child intrinsically, and not understanding that, I think, as you beautifully put it, it's coming from that dysregulated emotional state. So I think that's another, again, damaging narrative that fast forward in time, no matter how long it is, adults could still be operating around with some level of belief that, particularly around their emotional experience, again, originating at a time where they didn't have the language for it, and it was just a misalignment in parent and child. The child now, who is the adult, becomes, they feel badly about their own emotional experience. And this could globalize. So I've had even clients who say, I was told I was an overly sensitive child. I was too much. And now they become the adult that I think struggles to own their own emotional world, again, because of just these statements said in these times when it was coming from an inaccurate perception on the parent's part, where the parent did on some level not have the understanding that you are now imparting, in an invaluable way. So parents listening, if you do see your children engaging in any of those behaviors, could be really helpful to just stop for a moment and take a step back and maybe try to understand it through now this new lens, that what's happening for your child is a dysregulated emotion and not an attempt to not cooperate or not whatever it was that your own narrative might have been telling you.
Yes. And I think all the boundaries work is so important with this, not managing their emotions or feeling that we are responsible to keep them happy all of the time. So I see that a lot where parents or caregivers think that if their child's happy, that's a reflection of their success or their skills as a parent or caregiver. And it can be tough to separate from that when we grew up thinking that, mom or dad is mad, so they must be, I did something wrong, or it's my fault, or all those thoughts that show up. So yes, in the moment, we see that all the time with how do you separate and realize that their emotions really don't have to do with us as much as we think they do. So it's a really important thing to think
Yeah,
about.
absolutely. Another really good point there too, because, coming myself from a very enmeshed, codependent, especially emotionally codependent family, that was definitely messaging that I was given. And out there we get two versions of messaging. Sometimes a very direct message. You did this, and mommy, you made mommy, or you made daddy mad, sad, whatever it is, glad even, right? Messaging directly. You did this, that action on your part resulted in this feeling on someone else's part. I think that's an implicit message that you are responsible for someone else's emotions. And I think it also could happen much more indirectly, where just, the emotional climate of the whole family unit is impacted by one individual, meaning when one person is upset, the whole family unit, that kind of bleeds into that upset space as well. Regardless, again, you do, I think, evolve into the adult who struggles in those similar ways, feeling responsible, engaging possibly in helper or caretaking or a million different other functions or behaviors in relationships.
Perfectionism.
Right. Yes. Aimed at just managing someone else's emotional experience. And I also want to acknowledge, not having children myself either, I can't imagine what it would be like to watch your child or experience your child in their sadness, grief, anger. I'm sure it's quite difficult. And a lot of times natural, I would imagine, for the parent to want to swoop in and try to make it better, I think from that angle too. But I think, to speak to your point, that also can be doing the child a disservice, not allowing themselves to develop their own emotional regulation. So with that said, if you do start to see these dysregulated moments in your little ones, what do we do? How do we deal with the big feelings that are happening in that moment? And how do we help our child to deal with the big feelings that are happening in that moment?
So the first kind of foundation to all this, and that I didn't speak to as much in the first point, was that getting to know the child's signals and cues first means also knowing what really brings them joy and pleasure and fun. And first helping them feel safe, seen, soothed, and secure, which is Dan Siegel terms for all those things, as contributing to a level of calm and organization. So we really want to know the child in both their dysregulated states or their disorganization, but really spend the bulk of our time is spent helping them feel seen or heard, and whatever that means to that individual child. So focusing on what brings them fun or joy in daily routines and integrating that into their day and knowing what lights them up. And I think a lot of us are still figuring that out. If there isn't, again, this adult there to guide, oh, you're really into that, you should go do that. That's not, it's more about what society wants and what the expectations of everybody around us are. So if we can help kids from a young age understand that, yes, they are totally unique, and their wants and needs and interests are totally unique, and how do we nurture that and grow that and build that's where we get vitality and the zest for life that we want, and that really sets us up to ride that roller coaster a little bit, and have more fun.
Yeah,
So,
I love that too. And I love the point that you're making about, where is the limit between I accept that as just you as an individual child, aside from what everyone else in the world. And I say that because I think a lot of us are overly concerned and have maybe even been ourselves raised as now the parent, from a caregiver who was overly concerned about what that meant. If the world, in a sense, sees my child liking this thing, might that reflect negatively on me? And I think that's a reality. And I also want to touch on, because I think we're having two separate conversations, which is really interesting, right? How do we parent, help the child, right? But what is also happening in the adult? Because I also believe that a difficulty, and again, I'm likely speaking predominantly from my own experience, because as a child, can't help it, but growing up in a family that was constant fight or flight mode, I had very few moments of co-sharing joy with a caregiver, to my detriment. So it became, and I say this because, again, I think something else to just consider in the climate is the more fight or flight, and I say this again because I think a lot of adult humans are spending incredible, disproportionate amount of times in that fight or flight state. So really gaining control of your own nervous system responses so that you can inhabit that joy space with the child. Because again, I use my example, my parents as my caregivers were unable to find joy on their own. They did not have interests and hobbies and pleasures and joyful moments, as sad as that is, in their own personal world. So when it came to co-sharing that with me, it was just something they were not able to give themselves. So how would they then be able to meet me in a joyful moment? They weren't. So again, I just want to weave that in, because I think that's another part of this story when we talk about being the conscious adult as well, is making sure that you're healing your own nervous system responses so that you can, kind of share those moments with your children. And I think that they're, to speak to your point, incredibly invaluable. And a lot of us do end up becoming the adult who, how many times I hear, I don't know myself. I don't know what I want. I don't know what my interests are. And that's okay. We can reconnect with ourselves and rebuild our own connections to interest and joy. But I think, kind of finding those moments with our children is going to set them on a path to always be connected to themselves and their positive experiences of the world in an invaluable way.
Mm-hmm. And it's so true that if the emotion isn't seen or felt deeply by another person in early childhood, then it really can come off as invalidating, and the child creates a story that they're not good enough or it's their fault again. So there is a lot of layers that we have from early childhood that if things aren't going well and our shame is triggered, then that really keeps us and prevents us from being in the moment with the child, unless we're able to step back and observe it and question it, other than just repeating this, shame tape over and over again. That really keeps us from being, on the floor, in the moment, spontaneous, silly, and all of that good stuff. So yes, much easier said than done. And there's so much work that can go into just being available in the moment, especially if that wasn't the case for us growing up. So yes, huge disclaimer. Thank you for that. Before we dive into these in the moment things, there's so much that goes into this. I think it's mostly outside the moment stuff that goes into this, in the moment, big feelings. So
no, I could not agree more. I actually love that statement, because I am always talking words like consistency and habit and change in that more global scale, because unfortunately, as much I think as a lot of us humans like to have those as needed, kind of PRN, deploy in the moment, toolkit, that the reality of it is, and I'm happy you're making that point, is beyond that, is living and, consistently practicing and healing more often than not, more consistently than not, so that in the moment then we can show up as that fully present adult, whether it's in their joy, or I think shifting into it when they're not in such a joyful state as well. But I'm so happy you even touched on the joy, because I think so many of us are focusing, when we have these conversations, our mind predominantly goes to, okay, well, when it's not working, when they're kicking, when they're screaming, when they're not in a good emotional place, what then? But I love beautifully, because there's the positive too, and that's just as important. So I'm really, really happy actually that you started there.
Yes. And every time you have that really rich reciprocal back and forth interaction, it's almost like we're strengthening this attention and regulation muscle, where they're getting these reps of, interaction feels good. There's this pleasurable hormones that are being released through the body, and it's setting this really nice glue for them, putting a lot of things together that they can recruit when things are tough. And I think that's why play is so important, because it really allows them a safe place to play out some of these tough emotions and experiences, and realize that the caregivers are on their side. So after that, the first thing that I would do in the moment is always observe. So observe and think, okay, who do I need to regulate first, myself or them? So and I think this is where some people start to realize that they maybe have unresolved trauma that showed up. And developmental trauma is, I think, so prevalent. And I loved your post on trauma and how it can show up in so many different ways, because for many of us, and I think this is a big part of observe, so I'll mention it briefly, but developmental trauma can happen anytime a child is upset and their nervous system is telling them to go to their caregiver. So go to safety, seek safety to soothe. It's a biological instinct. And then the parent, though, if they are the ones that are the threat to the child in the moment. So if the parent is the one that's yelling a little bit louder than they maybe would like to, and it's coming across to the child as scary, And the child's nervous system is saying, run away, get away from the threat. So if the threat and the safety source are the same, then it creates this rift in the body and the mind and emotions that can be like little traumatic moments, especially if they're not repaired. So for a lot of us, repair wasn't a big thing. So, people get mad, people get angry, and then there's no repair. So the child creates this story subconsciously that, again, it's their fault and they're bad. So it's like these little traumatic experiences that in the moment when everybody is upset, as the caregiver, that might be showing up for us. So how do you step back and observe that and then recreate a tape around it, or just observe and think, okay, there it is. I'm thinking it's my fault. Is it my fault? Probably not in this moment. So, so that's the first step, is observe if we need to regulate ourselves first, and then we can move to them. So that's really the first step, is just being in the moment and trying not to leave them unless, there's something that is triggering you that you really do need space. So if there's threat and you feel anger coming up and you do need to separate from the child in the moment to be safe, that's very true. So like rage, I think, even I've had rage in my personal relationships that showed up as kind of unresolved trauma that I didn't know, that I really had to work through. And there's so much shame that comes with that, because it's like all of a sudden you snap and it's emotional flashback. And in the moment, you're not thinking clearly. So you're not able to think like, oh, take a breath and have space. It's more like, okay, how do you do something and move yourself away so you're not, hurting something or hurting somebody? And I think this is something that people don't talk about, that especially as parents, when you're biologically triggered in the moment, it happens. And people talk about it more and more. And it's so powerful, because once we get it out there, we can shift it. But if it's stuck inside and you're feeling, shame and guilt over it, it'll eat us up. So that's, I think, a really important part of this step one, is if there's something, deeper going on, we need to get there.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important part too, because I just love how you normalize that. And I don't think people are talking about it enough. And I think that there is so much shame just over possibly a belief, that I shouldn't feel this way about my child. Well, again, if understanding, right, which is why I talk about the inner child and the wounds and all of that we carry from our own past experiences. That's why I think awareness is always an important first step of change, because now I can understand that what's happening. It's not actually right about my child really at all in the moment. The child, for lack of a better words, is just acting as the catalyst, right, for this deeper emotional pain that I'm feeling. But I think it's unfortunate that a lot of times, and if we do react in a way that's less than favorable, not that I am ever condoning, right, anything that could escalate in terms of a parent-child relationship, but we then leave that and we feel so probably inordinate, like devastatedly shameful, and we take it to mean something about us who could never cross a line like that with a child. And again, I just think we have to understand that we do lose a sense of control. We are straight back in that emotional brain and its protective mechanisms, which are, again, really I simplify it, right? I either check out, so I can either completely abandon my child and not be present in any way, shape, or form. If I'm really acutely triggered, that is what my mom would do with me. So for me, dissociate, right? So for me, the messaging I got that conflict in a relationship, talk about repair, was not repairable. My mom actually, I lost my mom, my caregiver, when she was angry. And that's a devastating message to internalize as a child. Or obviously we do the other kind of more extreme end of the spectrum, the outward behaviors. We kick, we yell, and then we're the parents doing that. But again, I think that we could carry so much shame, and we have to understand that we do at a point lose that control. So we do have to take a step. And I always say time sometimes is our best friend in those moments where I just distance myself, put some physical space between me and the triggering event, if you will, child included, to down regulate enough to then be able to come back online and make a new choice. Trying to navigate that in the moment when some of these really deep emotions are that alive for us, we're in a losing battle in a sense.
Yes. I think one technique that's been helpful is in the moment to repeat the emotion that you're feeling, or if you can label what you're feeling. So just say anger, 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 or fear, fear, fear. Tara Brach, who is one of my favorite. She has podcasts and she's a great resource for this kind of stuff. And then if you can get to some compassion, and I care about this pain, I care about this anger, I care about this sadness. So again, it's more cognitive. So you need to be a level of calm in order to access that. But if you can even start doing that in little moments outside in daily life, that's a really helpful one that I think is the same idea of what we want for kids, which is to help them label it. So then the next step would be to really focus on emotional cues in the moment. So like you said, it's this emotional, more primitive brain that's activated under stress. So if a child is in stress, they need us to avoid any logic or teaching. So as adults, our tendency is to go to logic or teaching, or, if the child is at the store and wants a toy and they start crying because they're so upset that they don't have the toy. So a parent might think, Johnny, you have a million toys at home. You have so many toys at home you can play with. Why do you want, this doesn't make sense. Why are you crying? So unknowingly and unintentionally, we're invalidating the child's experience, and they are really feeling like neurologically, this is real for them in the moment. So they're thinking of this toy. This is their whole world right now, which is kind of this beautiful centrism, egocentric mode of early childhood that comes in. Like their whole world is into the moment, and their whole world is that toy. So if we say no, it's like we're rocking their world, we're shattering their visual in their mind, and they're not able to adapt and think about those toys at home. So if we invalidate, or we say that, no, don't cry, no, stop, this doesn't make sense, like you're fine, you have so many toys at home, then that's setting up the child for confusion in making meaning of that sensation in their body, which is emotion. So whether we know it or not, we're invalidating. So if we can connect from the emotional level instead of the logical level, that's really where we need to start with kids, is to how do we connect at the emotional level versus triggering them further. So typically when we say that, child feels not seen and not heard, and it triggers and heightens their stress response in the moment versus helping to downregulate it back to where they might be able to visualize or problem solve another option.
I love that. I actually took a minute while you were chatting and I wrote down making meaning out of the sensation. I just love that as kind of a practical, what are you doing? What is happening? What is the goal of a parent in that moment? And I love that, making meaning out of the emotional sensation that they're having in their bodies and giving them words to understand it, explore it, maybe give words to it ultimately over time, depending on how old the child is. I just think that's such, Katie, a beautiful way to describe kind of the act or the function or what's actually happening there in a way that can be much more expansive and exploratory, as opposed to like you're saying, the logical attempt in that moment. And I think if we're all honest as adults, right, we can remember the time, maybe it was more recently than not for some of us, right, where we were in an emotional state, and maybe it was our partner or some loved one that in a very well-intentioned, attempt at talking us down off the ledge or, making it okay for us, maybe did similarly try a more logic-based approach, right, where it's pointed out to me all of the logical reasons why what I'm feeling is really not that big of a deal and is okay in the moment. I think most of us can remember back to when that moment happened for us and say, okay, that did feel a little bit invalidating. That didn't feel good. Like, I'm not looking for someone to logically solve the problem. This is language I often use. I'm not looking to have a problem solved. I'm just looking for someone to just allow myself and my feelings to be. And I think as an extension, maybe to be seen and understood. And like you were saying earlier, I think the drives that we all have as humans that Dan Siegel talks about, right? To be just known, our emotional worlds included, by another. And that is how we can feel, I believe, more known, as opposed to just having the problem solved for us. I don't actually think that's what any of us really want in those moments at all. And getting that can be really invalidating.
Totally. Yeah. And it takes a level of comfort with their emotions in order to go there. And I think it's like, we're all kind of uncomfortable with emotion. Our society is like, be this way, don't be that way. You can be sad, but not too much or not too long. And then you're not okay. So there's so much judgment. And yeah, I think the fact of the matter with kids is that in the moment, they're not able to go logical at all. So if we are trying to use words and literally say things, so sometimes when I say name it to tame it, or focus on connection, then the adult is using words. Oh, Johnny, you look sad. Or you're mad right now. You're mad right now. But they're saying it in a way that isn't emotional. So when I say emotional and connecting with that side or that part of the brain, we're focusing on our body and our tone of voice, our volume of voice, the space that we have between words, less language. So yes, words are rarely soothing when they're used alone. So we can say things, but our body might be saying a complete other. So we'll have a caregiver that's saying something, but their presence is saying, stop this, we need to go somewhere. Like I'm frustrated, but their words are saying something different. So if we can, I say less language, even just no talking at all. So that's kind of the next step. Even just no talking, just stop talking in the moment and get down at their level. So think about body positioning and how we can support a sense of safety. So if you're a big person standing over this little child, it's a sense of threat, whether we're intending it to be or not. So getting down at their eye level or below, kneeling, even laying down on the floor and not talking. So you are like this safe being that is there to help them energetically make sense of this, and focusing on, maybe eye contact, but for some kids, eye contact is too much, or it can be triggering in the moment. So again, going back to reading their signals and their cues and what works for them in the moment for co-regulation, because it's so different for every child. So if we don't know what works for the child, it can be tough to move on and move through this process and connect at the emotional level that they may need.
Absolutely. I love those very practical suggestions too, because these are likely things that might not even cross the adult's mind in that moment, right? You're used to just kind of talking down or at, or, talking at the regular rhythm of voice. So I think some of those slight shifts to the delivery of the message and the nonverbals of it speaks to 2 points, I think that we're consistently making, which is know yourself and know, if you are in that more dysregulated end of the spectrum where you cannot, make that alignment between words and actions, because as I will always say a million times over, it may be just my belief, but however you think we get to this planet, I believe we are so attuned individuals, so little children. So they're going to know, and they're going to pick up possibly even more strongly on the nonverbal aspect of your communication. So even if you're gritting your teeth and trying so hard to say the right things, and I throw this out there as well, because I think, again, very well-intentioned parents want to have the toolkit of the right things to say, but you're really highlighting, again, that internal part of the work too, really making sure that you can put those into alignment with then the practical tools of what is safe body communication, or what are safer feeling for most children. But again, acknowledging that even within that, there's individual variance. So you could actually end up having a child, very assumably, that the child's preference in terms of what happens when emotionally activated might be much different than what you find as helpful or soothing. And I say that because I think it's really natural that we assume of most others similarity, right? So if this makes me feel calm, I assume this makes everyone else feel calm. And again, without having actual children myself, I can only imagine that is extended, if not amplified, when it's your child. Why would they not, gain soothing in this type of behavior if that's what you do? And something I learned very early on clinically was not to make those assumptions about anyone. Even if you're speaking the same language and we're both saying, yeah, we're anxious, that doesn't mean that our anxieties mean the same thing to both of us. So really, like you're offering, explore, understand the child, and question whether or not you're projecting, okay, this is what works for me, so I'm assuming this works for Johnny. That might not be actually what works for Johnny. Actually see how Johnny reacts and see if it's soothing as well for Johnny, and then great. And if it's not, find the things that Johnny finds soothing and then meet him in his space.
And that's such a good point, because this isn't a linear process in, step 1, observe, step 2, meet them emotionally, step 3, validate or normalize. We're constantly going back to the observe. So if you go in and connect emotionally, then you're observing and thinking, okay, did that seem to shift anything? Can I create space here and wait or watch and observe if it's helpful for them? Because yes, it's such a good point that it is so different for everybody. And it's more about the, how of what we're doing instead about the what. So we can share these details, but it really is the art of, there's such an art and science in this. It's affect regulation science and what works for the child, but it's also this art and this nuanced way of adapting. So if something's not working, then we adapt and we go back in this process and observe and learn how to connect with the child versus them feeling separate and isolated and triggering that fear response again. So that's a huge part, is we're constantly going back to observe, and that's step one that I say. So step 3 then is where I get to the validate, acknowledge, and normalize. So once we notice that the child is calm enough to not need sensory strategies to soothe, that's another disclaimer. So Bruce Perry has a triangle online if anybody's interested in Googling. It's called the Learning Triangle. He's a trauma researcher, and but it really goes to build safety in all kids. And it's this powerful triangle where the bottom is regulate. So as an OT, when I think about regulate, we're thinking about sensory strategies to soothe. So if a child is so upset that they can't process language, they're really triggered, and they need us to go back to more infantile ways of soothing. So that's where we think rocking, holding, using sounds, or running water, I think is something that I see to be calming for some infants or little kids. So we're going back to these sensory strategies to soothe the body at the emotional body level. And then when a child is ready to go to the next stage, which is relate, so up the triangle goes regulate, relate, reason. At relate, that's where we would bring in some of the other co-regulation techniques across space. So you think about, instead of the child being on our body or really connected physically, then we're moving across space a little bit and giving this chance for them to take on some of the regulation on their own with us directly there. So that's where these techniques like eye contact or physical presence, where we're just on the floor next to them without holding them. So we're stretching out that energy and their capacity to regulate a little bit. So instead of rocking, we might just be rhythmically matching their body in the moment across at arm's length, or across the room if that's what it seems like they need. So moving on to those co-regulation strategies. And then the top is reason. Or actually, I'll go back to relate a little bit. So the validating could come in there, where you might just be saying, I know, or trying to show that we're with them, we see what they're experiencing, and we're matching it, or we're honoring it in a way that helps them feel heard and helps them make sense of that sensation or the emotion in the body. So you might say, going back to the toy example, that toy looked so cool. That toy, it had those buttons you could press on it. Those look so cool. So again, more affect, you bring in more affect, because that clicks the emotional brain in. So, oh my gosh, it had that blue color, and you love blue. It was really blue. It was really shiny. I bet it looked really cool in the sun. And that's when they're like, you get me. You get that toy was really cool to me. And yeah, that would be cool to play with that out in the sun. So no matter what it is, you have to be kind of truly empathetic and truly authentically understanding of it. So if you say, just like you said, if it seems inauthentic, or if it seems like you're just going through the motions to get them on their way, it takes a lot of the power out of that moment. So you really have to, think and dig deep. What is cool about that toy? Even if you think it's not really, you're digging deep, and helping the child in the moment to really, almost like it's counterintuitive, because you're pushing into the emotion. You're pushing into, wow, that is so sad that you can't bring that home right now. Like that stinks. That sucks. So, how do we deeply validate that, and acknowledge and normalize why they're feeling that way. It makes sense that you're so bummed about that. Like, you've never seen a toy like that before, and we have nothing like that at home. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's
I
so,
love that. I love those examples too, Katie. And I love too, at minimum, if you don't in that moment as the parent, right, maybe have access to speech to the empathy, or to maybe legitimately you don't understand, right, where the feelings are coming from, from the child, even just a minimum, what could seem like a minimal, I know, like, I love that you offered that as just a general good response or better response in that moment. Obviously, if you can fully join the child and see from the child's eyes what they are imagining is so great. But I think even just a simple I know, and allowing that space to be held, even if you don't really truly understand, which brings to me then I'm wondering, if there's also a scenario where you ask, if you do obviously have the emotional bandwidth and you are in that more regulated state as the parent, might that also be a time to maybe inquire about the child, or from the child, or at a later time have the child help you to understand what was so upsetting? I don't know if the child would have access to that in that acutely, emotional moment, but I'm wondering, could that also be a moment of just exchange where you ask of your child what was, upsetting or problematic, or?
I think, yes, if you can observe, so really closely observing if the child is still in their emotional state, so the more reactive, impulsive, wanting to grab the toy, if we ask what they're feeling in that moment, it will likely trigger stress, because they're unable to access the cognitive tools that require language formulation in the moment. So then their nervous system is saying, there's this demand on me that I can't make meaning of because I'm in the stress response mode. So then it can further trigger it. So when we see that the child is clicking into us and tuning in a way that they're looking at us, they're feeling like we see them, they're feeling heard, that's when I might say, I wonder what you're feeling right now. Or I wonder what you, what you're thinking. Or just creating some space for them to label it and to feel it. Because again, it is tough, because yes, we want to label it, but we don't want to assume what they're feeling. So maybe they're mad and we're calling it sad, and that's conflicting. So, and vice versa. So I think anytime we can create space in this process for them to volitionally or intentionally share what they're feeling is positive. However, doing it at a time that makes sense for that child. And if you notice, and of course, nobody's perfect, and we really just need to be good enough throughout this process. So recognizing that we will mess up and we will label and say the wrong thing, and good enough and safe enough. And if we're intentional and we're really trying, like recognizing that we will mess up, and that's part of this process with them, is we might assume they feel a certain way and they don't, and then we can repair that. So
right. I love that distinction. Thank you for making that and clarifying it. Because again, I do work with a lot of clients who are also parents and who are trying very intentionally to be conscious parents. And I love that you kind of acknowledge that distinction. So while it is helpful and it can be a moment of conversation, making sure, again, the parent is aware that in that acutely emotional moment, it is actually experienced by the child as an additional stressor. Because again, a well-intentioned parent trying so desperately to be very conscious, my concern, the reason why I ask for that clarity, is that then it's almost an overly questioning and an attempt at trying to verbally communicate again with the child who is in too much of a distress state to do that. So making sure, again, that attunement around the emotional world of the child comes first before even an attempt at verbally understanding. And favor, when the child is too activated, I think what I'm hearing you say is just meeting them, holding space in that emotion is always going to be preferable. So thank you for clarifying, because I think, again, that could come up from a very well-intentioned place, but could possibly just be exacerbating the child's response.
Yes, the intellectualizing kind of consciousness and what that means and where we are, and we want to share. I think this happens like with adult relationships too, where in the moment it's like you want to intellectualize and share all this great stuff you're learning, but the other person just isn't ready, and it's triggering. So I think the more we can recognize how that feels, the more we can understand how it might be helpful for them in the moment. So, so I would go, 1, observe, 2, focus on the emotional aspects versus logical. 3 is acknowledge, validate, normalize. And 4, when they're calm enough, I'd reaffirm the limit and the why. So going back to the toy example, I would say, oh, but we can't get this toy today because, whatever your why is, or maybe, it doesn't need to be this really profound why, just we aren't getting a toy today. Today isn't a day to get toys. So reaffirming that there is the practicality and reaffirming the limit in a connected way. So instead of a punitive way, which I think, if a caregiver is feeling guilty and they, maybe there's not money for the toy or there's stress behind it, then that can come out and say, no, like we're not getting a toy today. No, this is not happening. So it's, again, more about the how, more about that. No, we can't get that. Oh, it'd be so cool if we could, but today isn't a toy day. We can't, maybe in a few weeks. Or then getting to problem solving. So the last step is problem solve. And I wonder if it would help if we did a pillow fight for 5 minutes when we got home. Or what if I wonder if it would help if, I know you're really bummed about the toy. I wonder if you want a piggyback ride to the car, or helping them to visualize and move back to a positive interacted state. So anytime we go through this negative affectual experience together and then move back to a positive, and it's this constant balance of letting time or creating space for the emotion to release and then getting back to the positive. So it's building this cycle of regulation in the child that they can pull from down the road when it's time for them to self-regulate. So problem solving or visualizing in their mind that there is something after that moment in the store where they're sad, and helping them get there. So that's the final step before, I would say, or repair if needed. So
I love that. Can I just stop you here for a second? Because
yes.
have a question I want to clarify. Both of the examples you gave in that kind of return to positive co-regulation were interactive, right? Just what I heard, right? Piggyback ride, pillow fight. You as parent are involved. And I'm just wondering, actually, for devil's advocate's sake, is that important that you engage in the positive experience? Because again, I'm just thinking, and this is probably, again, coming from my own experience, another version could be here's ice cream that I know you like. You can return to happy from this bowl of ice cream, but mom can obviously be in the other room and not a part of my happiness in my ice cream intake. Obviously, that's my personal example I'm using.
Yes.
How important is it that the parent, to really put it simply, kind of be involved in that or be a participant in that imagined future, even in the imagining aspect of it and or the execution of it? Or is it okay to find something that the child can engage in more individually that also is just toward that more positive affective experience?
Great question. So when we're thinking about how we used to be, all in a tribe, and when we were so connected and relationship was really set the stage for our safety and our security, and it was the biggest tool for regulation. So biologically, and our nervous systems are wired for connection. So if we can take out all this noise that we've learned, it really is innate in us to go to another human when we're upset, or when we need something, or when we need to feel and exchange the energy. So yes, so focusing on positive interaction with another human is a lot different than, oh, you know what, let's go get this candy bar. That'll make you feel better. Or we're resorting to, okay, here's an iPad. Like, you're done crying. Here's the iPad. You can go on it for 10 minutes. So how do we shift in a way that will help them realize that humans are safe enough to go to when they're upset? So one thing I think about in teen suicide, which is really close to my heart, is we want kids, no matter the age, to come to us when things are difficult or when things are tough. So if we can teach them at the young age that, yes, go to a human, things will get better, things will be more positive, then that sets the stage for life. And so many of us don't have adaptive patterns when it comes to being upset. So we go to maladaptive things like scrolling social media mindlessly, or perfecting everything in our lives, performing or doing constantly instead of being with others. There's so many tools, or addiction, alcoholism, drugs. There's so many numbing things that we use because we're trying to feel better, and we didn't get this repetition of feeling what it's like to feel with a human and release the emotion and metabolize it in a safe way. So we all have, like you said, that stuck energy that's built up versus this ability to be present in the moment and to share it and to move on and to recognize that it's all part of the human experience and it's how we're wired.
Absolutely. Thank you for clarifying. And I'm not surprised that that was the answer, but I do just want to acknowledge that, because I think, again, another tendency can be to use the thing. And that can, again, translate, like you're saying, to the adult then who looks for the thing that's not obviously a person in this moments.
Yes. And then repair. So that anytime there's a rupture in the relationship, so recognizing that none of us are perfect, perfection is not the goal, even as part of the developmental process, anytime we mess up. So yes, these are all beautiful opportunities. These emotional experiences are opportunities to connect and help them develop regulation. However, if you've had a lot of opportunities in a short amount of time, I'm feeling with whoever you are, because it's not as simple, and it's not, it's much easier to talk about and to intellectualize and to go through these cognitive steps than it is to be in the moment, triggered, and everybody's crying and you're pulled in all these different directions. So recognizing that good enough and present as present as we can be is the goal. And then anytime we do mess up, so you yell a little bit louder than you wanted to, maybe you grab them harder than you meant to. So anytime we have a rupture like that, then we make repair. So maybe afterward you talk about it, or even draw a picture of what happened and tell a story about it, and tell the child that how you're feeling. So I didn't mean to, I yelled louder than I meant to. Maybe that was scary. Like, you could have been scared. That makes sense. Next time I'm trying to not yell as loudly, and, whatever it is for you. So creating a story that makes the child, or lets the child know that it wasn't their fault. It wasn't because of them. It was because their parent's a human going through this process too. So it's a big way to create resilience in the child and let them know that things will go wrong in life and things will happen, but it doesn't mean that they're bad or things aren't okay or that conflict isn't safe. It means that we can get through it together, and it sets them up for not just relational stress, but academic stress or life stress that comes up. So rupture repair is a big ending to anytime we do inevitably mess up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you're touching on the value of those repair moments in terms of becoming the more resilient, than adult, so having a parent who's able to admit when, because again, I get a lot of parents that will reach out to me in one of two ways, right? Oh, I did this shameful thing in the middle of being triggered by my child. But I'll also have parents reach out to me, especially when I talk about the theta wave developmental period, right? Birth to age 7, I'll have a lot of people like, oh shoot, like I'm already past that. Have I already, and my answer, regardless of the moment you're reaching out, is always the same, that there's so much more, kind of value in repair and talking about it. And, we are all human. And I think damage is more often done when you have the parent who doesn't, for their own, kind of difficult, reasons, not want to admit those things. Because again, the child's brain, like I will always say, is going to find a story. It's going to spin its own story. So if you can fill in the pieces with the reality of what it was, that like I said earlier, and you're also acknowledging, the child was attuned to, understood on a level. So if you come back and you just acknowledge and give words to the reality that the child already sensed, I believe implicitly you're not only building up emotional resilience, that you're admitting humans are fallible and we sometimes don't do great things that the child can gain value in, but I believe you're actually allowing the child's reality to be more in alignment then. So the child can say, oh, I was accurate. This was right. Mom was upset in that moment, and told me she wasn't. That's really confusing. So I think on a deep level, those moments of repair can offer that validation in a sense for the child and their reality that they already were vibing on. They knew more or less what was happening. So I think it also gives words to that too, because again, I think a lot of us become the adult that doesn't trust ourselves because we've had those moments of mismatch where the parent didn't come back and say, you know what, this is what actually did happen, and I'm sorry, and I'm human, and now we can have this beautiful moment of repair. I think that also is a value in that.
Yes, we so want to have meaning of things, and the coherent narrative of what happened is super validating. So I know I experienced that myself I didn't really know why this unresolved emotion was showing up the way it was. I had autoimmune disease, I had chronic fatigue, I had things that were showing up in my body, and really kind of forced me to pause, because I've always been such a doer, like do, just don't feel, just, you'll be good. Feelings, nah, don't go there. So it really forced me to slow down and to think about what did happen and what my life looked like and how this impacted me. And the coherent narrative is such a big piece of our own journeys, in a way that it's so cool now to think about how we're doing that for kids in this rupture repair sequence. And creating this tape that you're right, it's more closely related to the truth versus the maladaptive stories that we tell ourselves for lives if they're not coming out in a meaningful way.
100%. And I think, thank you, Katie. Seriously, this conversation today, and I mean, the takeaways that I have, and again, not even having children, I think I really appreciate all of your work, to be honest. Not only the way you conceptualize and understand, kind of, I think all of these different levels of parenting and of emotion and emotional resilience and nervous system activation, and really putting it together in these really practical applications and approaches. I think there's going to be many parents out there that are going to listen to this, that are going to have the takeaways, not only a deeper understanding of what's going on, but okay, and now of what to do. Because I think there's a lot of us that desperately want to start to do different, and that because some of this information is really overwhelming, and because, again, we're a human involved in the scenario and having our own emotional experiences to what's happening, that having these practical understanding, but also the go-to, the tools, exactly what to do in the moment. I think you're going to shift and impact, just from this conversation here today, a lot of parents out there beyond the amazing work that you're doing. So everyone listening, I'm going to link up all of your information below. Thriving Littles. I seriously am always, when parents reach out to me, I'm always directing them to all of your work and your stuff, because it's just even not having parents, or not having children, I think you just are such an invaluable force in this world. And I so appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today, and everything that you shared. It was truly amazing. So thank you.
Yeah, I so appreciate being here, and your community is such a rich opportunity for everybody to gain some of the shared experiences and get everything out there and building our own coherent narratives. And it's exciting stuff. So yeah, thanks so much for having me.
It is super exciting. All right, guys, thank you so much. And check out Katie's page. Awesome.